The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of Millbrook, but Kestrel Vance barely noticed the beauty of the crimson sky. She pressed her back against the cold brick wall of the pharmacy, her heart hammering as she listened to the shuffling footsteps growing closer. 3 weeks had passed since the outbreak began, and she had learned that sunrise brought no comfort anymore, only the harsh reminder that another night of horror had given way to another day of survival. The infected moved differently in daylight. Kestrel had observed this pattern during her careful reconnaissance missions through the city's skeletal remains. Their movements became more erratic, more aggressive, as if the sun's rays triggered something primal in their deteriorated nervous systems. She clutched the worn notebook where she meticulously recorded these observations, each entry potentially meaning the difference between life and death for her growing group of survivors. Dr. Riven Ashworth emerged from the pharmacy's rear entrance, his weathered face grim as he shook his head. The 60-year-old physician had become their unofficial leader in medical matters, though his knowledge of the infected's physiology remained frustratingly limited. "Empty," he whispered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "They've cleaned out everything useful. We'll need to venture deeper into the commercial district." Kestrel nodded, her mind already calculating routes and risks. At 28, she had transitioned from her role as a city planning consultant to something she never imagined, a tactician in humanity's fight for survival. Her background in urban logistics and emergency management had proven invaluable in these desperate times. She understood traffic patterns, infrastructure weaknesses, and most importantly, how to move groups of people efficiently through hostile territory. The sound of breaking glass echoed from 2 blocks away, followed by the unmistakable chorus of infected voices, a mixture of growls, moans, and something that might have once been human speech. Kestrel immediately recognized the pattern. A group of at least 15, possibly 20 infected, had likely been attracted to movement or sound. In the early days, survivors had made the mistake of thinking the infected were mindless. They had learned, painfully, that while diminished, some primitive intelligence remained. Thorne Blackwood materialized from the shadows across the street, his former military training evident in every calculated movement. The 35-year-old had served 2 tours overseas before the outbreak, and his combat experience had become invaluable to their survival efforts. He held up his hand, fingers spread, their silent signal for a group of 5 infected nearby. His dark eyes met Kestrel's, and she saw the same grim determination that had carried them through countless close calls. Their current safe house, a fortified community center on the edge of town, housed 14 survivors. Each person brought unique skills that contributed to their collective survival strategy. Zara Nightingale, barely 22, had transformed from a computer programmer into their communications and surveillance specialist. She had rigged together a network of cameras and early warning systems using salvaged electronics. Caspian Reed, an engineer in his 40s, had designed their fortifications and created ingenious traps that had saved them multiple times. The infected weren't their only concern. Food supplies dwindled daily, medical resources were nearly depleted, and the psychological toll of constant vigilance was beginning to fracture their group's cohesion. Indira Frost, their former therapist-turned-group counselor, worked tirelessly to maintain morale, but even she struggled with the weight of their circumstances. As Kestrel signaled for the retreat to safer ground, she reflected on the evolution of their survival strategies. Initially, they had focused purely on hiding and avoiding contact. Now, they were developing more sophisticated approaches, studying infected behavior patterns, creating detailed maps of safe routes, establishing supply caches, and most critically, learning to fight back intelligently rather than desperately. The infected might outnumber them thousands to one, but humans possessed something the infected had lost: the ability to plan, adapt, and hope. The real test of their strategies was approaching. Radio communications had revealed other survivor groups in the region, and whispers spoke of a massive infected horde moving toward their area. Soon, they would need to prove that human intelligence and cooperation could triumph over mindless hunger and overwhelming numbers. Nyx Carruthers moved through the abandoned office building with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to make silence a survival tool. At 17, she had become their most effective scout, her small frame and natural athleticism allowing her to navigate spaces that would trap larger adults. Her pale blue eyes missed nothing as she documented the infected's behavioral patterns on the building's third floor. She had discovered something crucial during her reconnaissance missions: the infected exhibited distinct behavioral cycles tied to environmental factors. During overcast days, they moved more sluggishly and seemed less responsive to distant sounds. Rain confused their tracking abilities, while wind scattered their scent-based detection. These observations had become the foundation of Kestrel's tactical planning, turning weather forecasts into strategic advantages. From her perch behind an overturned desk, Nyx watched 3 infected methodically search the floor below. Their movements weren't random, as initially believed. They demonstrated a form of primitive problem-solving, testing doors systematically and even attempting to coordinate their searches. One would investigate while the others maintained watch. This rudimentary teamwork had evolved since the outbreak's beginning, suggesting that whatever virus or condition had created them was still affecting their cognitive development. Back at the community center, Caspian Reed put the finishing touches on their latest defensive innovation. The engineer had designed a series of acoustic channels that could redirect sound away from their safe house or amplify it in specific directions. By understanding how the infected used hearing to hunt, he had created ways to manipulate their perception of human presence. Hidden speakers could create false audio signatures, leading infected away from actual survivor locations toward prepared kill zones. Dr. Riven Ashworth worked alongside Zara Nightingale in their makeshift laboratory, analyzing tissue samples from recently deceased infected. Their research had yielded disturbing discoveries about the infection's progression. The virus didn't simply reanimate dead tissue, it created a form of simplified neural network that allowed for basic learning and adaptation. This explained why the infected seemed to become more effective hunters as time passed. Zara's technical expertise had proven invaluable in developing countermeasures. She had created electromagnetic pulse devices using salvaged electronics that could temporarily disorient the infected by disrupting their heightened electromagnetic sensitivity. Her surveillance network had also revealed that infected groups developed hierarchical structures, with larger, more aggressive specimens directing the behavior of smaller groups. Thorne Blackwood trained a group of survivors in combat techniques specifically designed for fighting the infected. Traditional military tactics needed modification when facing enemies that felt no pain, showed no fear, and could function despite injuries that would incapacitate living humans. He emphasized precision over force, teaching survivors to target the infected's few genuine vulnerabilities, severing spinal connections, destroying brain tissue, or causing enough structural damage to impair mobility. The psychological aspects of survival had become equally critical. Indira Frost had implemented group counseling sessions that served multiple purposes beyond emotional support. These gatherings allowed survivors to share observations about infected behavior, discuss tactical innovations, and maintain the social bonds essential for coordinated defense. She had observed that survivors who remained isolated or withdrew from group activities became liabilities during crisis situations. Kestrel stood before a large map of the surrounding area, marked with colored pins representing different types of information. Red pins showed confirmed infected concentrations, blue indicated safe routes, green marked resource locations, and yellow highlighted potential escape routes. This visual representation of their tactical knowledge had become their most valuable asset, representing weeks of dangerous reconnaissance and careful observation. The map revealed patterns that individual scouting reports had missed. The infected seemed to establish territorial boundaries, with different groups claiming specific areas and rarely crossing into others' domains. Understanding these territorial divisions allowed the survivors to predict infected movements and identify relatively safe corridors for movement between locations. Their supply runs had evolved from desperate scavenging to calculated operations based on infected behavioral analysis. They had learned that certain times of day, weather conditions, and environmental factors created optimal windows for resource gathering. Morning fog provided visual concealment, while approaching storms caused infected to seek shelter, temporarily clearing outdoor areas. As evening approached, the survivors gathered for their daily briefing. Each person contributed intelligence gathered during their specialized activities, creating a comprehensive understanding of their tactical situation. These meetings had transformed from simple status updates into sophisticated strategic planning sessions, where human creativity and analytical thinking were deployed against an enemy that possessed only primitive instincts. Nix returned with disturbing news. The infected in the office building had demonstrated new behaviors, using simple tools, attempting to manipulate their environment, and showing signs of communication beyond basic vocalizations. The enemy was evolving, which meant their survival strategies would need to evolve as well. The crackling radio transmission cut through the morning silence like a lifeline thrown across an ocean of despair. Zara Nightingale adjusted the frequency with practiced precision, her heart racing as a clear voice emerged from the static. "This is Haven Base calling any survivors in the Millbrook area. We have supplies, medical facilities, and coordinated defense capabilities. Please respond if you can hear this message." Kestrel Vance felt a surge of hope mixed with caution as she took the microphone. 3 weeks of isolation had taught them that human contact could be either salvation or catastrophe. She had developed protocols for these situations, careful information sharing that revealed their capabilities without exposing their vulnerabilities. "Haven Base, this is Millbrook survivors. We have 14 people, mixed skill sets, and defensive position. What's your situation?" The response revealed a larger operation than they had dared hope for. Haven Base claimed 63 survivors organized into specialized teams, with a former military colonel named Marcus Sterling coordinating overall strategy. They possessed vehicles, heavy weapons, and most importantly, a plan for establishing a permanent safe zone. But they also brought troubling intelligence about infected evolution and reports of massive horde movements throughout the region. Dr. Riven Ashworth listened intently as Haven Base's medical officer described their research findings. The infected virus was demonstrating adaptive properties that defied traditional virology. Infected specimens showed improved coordination, enhanced sensory capabilities, and disturbing signs of retained memory from their pre-infection lives. Some infected had been observed returning to locations significant to their former human existence, suggesting that remnants of personality might persist within the viral restructuring. Thorne Blackwood felt both excitement and apprehension as he learned about Haven Base's military capabilities. They possessed armored vehicles, automatic weapons, and explosive devices that could significantly increase their defensive options. However, their contact also revealed the scope of infected concentrations in the broader region. Estimates suggested over 10,000 infected within a 50-mile radius, with numbers growing as survivors fell and urban areas became completely overrun. The decision to attempt contact required careful planning. Haven Base was located 37 miles northeast, requiring passage through several infected-controlled areas and potentially hostile territory held by other survivor groups. Kestrel proposed a 3-phase approach, sending a small advance team to establish contact, coordinating joint operations to test compatibility, and potentially relocating their entire group if Haven Base proved legitimate and secure. Caspian Reed worked feverishly to prepare mobile versions of their defensive innovations. If they were going to attempt contact with Haven Base, they needed portable advantages that could be deployed rapidly in unfamiliar territory. He created compact acoustic decoy devices, electromagnetic pulse generators that could fit in backpacks, and collapsible barrier systems that could provide temporary fortification during overnight stops. Nix Carruthers volunteered for the advance reconnaissance team despite her age. Her scouting abilities had become indispensable, and she possessed an intuitive understanding of infected behavioral patterns that could prove crucial during the dangerous journey. Kestrel initially resisted including someone so young in such a risky mission, but tactical necessity overruled maternal instincts. They simply couldn't afford to attempt contact without their best intelligence-gathering capabilities. The community center buzzed with preparation activities as survivors readied for what might be their most significant strategic decision since the outbreak began. Indira Frost conducted individual psychological assessments to ensure that potential team members could handle the stress of extended operations in hostile territory. The wrong person suffering a breakdown during a critical moment could doom the entire mission. Zara expanded their communication capabilities, creating relay points that would allow contact between the advance team and their base. She also developed emergency protocols for rapid information sharing, including coded signals that could convey complex tactical information through brief radio transmissions. If they encountered infected or hostile survivors during the journey, communication speed might determine survival. Their defensive preparations revealed how sophisticated their survival strategies had become. What had begun as desperate improvisation had evolved into systematic approaches to every aspect of survival. Food rationing followed mathematical models that balanced caloric requirements against activity levels and stress factors. Guard rotations optimized alertness while ensuring adequate rest. Even their psychological support systems had been refined through observation and adaptation. The infected, however, were also adapting. Recent reconnaissance had revealed coordinated group behaviors that suggested some form of communication or leadership hierarchy. Large infected concentrations moved with purpose rather than random wandering, and they had begun using simple tools and environmental manipulation to overcome obstacles. The enemy they faced was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. As night fell, the advance team conducted final equipment checks and route planning. Kestrel had selected herself, Thorn, Nyx, and Dr. Riven for the initial contact mission, leaving Caspian and Zara to coordinate base defense with the remaining survivors. The decision to potentially abandon their carefully fortified position represented both an opportunity for salvation and a risk that could destroy everything they had built. Tomorrow would test whether human cooperation could overcome the infected threat, or whether their isolation had been the only thing keeping them alive. The radio crackled with final communications from Haven Base, confirming rendezvous coordinates and emergency protocols. In 12 hours, they would discover if hope was justified or if they were walking into a trap that would end their survival story forever. Dawn brought the acrid smell of smoke from distant fires and the unwelcome sound of infected calls echoing across the abandoned landscape. Kestrel Vance checked her equipment one final time, the weight of leadership heavy on her shoulders as she prepared to lead her team into the unknown. The journey to Haven Base would require crossing 15 miles of contested territory, with at least 3 major infected concentrations blocking their planned route. Thorn Blackwood studied the modified path they had plotted during the night. Radio communication with Haven Base had revealed new intelligence about infected movements, forcing them to abandon their original route through the industrial sector. The alternative path led through residential areas where infected behavior was less predictable, but where they could use building structures for concealment and emergency shelter. Dr. Riven Ashworth carried medical supplies that could prove crucial if they encountered injured survivors or needed to treat infected bites during the journey. His research had yielded promising results regarding infection prevention, though no cure existed for the viral restructuring that created the infected. Time remained the critical factor. Early intervention could sometimes prevent complete neural deterioration, but only if treatment began within hours of exposure. Nyx Carruthers moved ahead of the group, her enhanced scouting abilities crucial for navigating the dangerous terrain. Her observations during recent reconnaissance missions had revealed that infected groups established patrol patterns around their territorial boundaries. Understanding these patterns allowed for precise timing of border crossings, but required split-second coordination and absolute silence during critical moments. Their first major challenge emerged 3 miles from the community center. A group of 12 infected had established position around an overturned bus that blocked their intended path. Kestrel observed their behavior through binoculars, noting the hierarchical arrangement that had become increasingly common among infected groups. One larger specimen, showing advanced viral development, directed the others' movements with primitive gestures and vocalizations. Thorn recognized the tactical problem immediately. Direct confrontation would create noise that could attract additional infected from surrounding areas. Avoidance required a significant detour that would add hours to their journey and increase exposure to other threats. The solution required creative application of their developed strategies, using the infected's behavioral patterns against them. Caspian's acoustic decoy devices proved invaluable for the first time in field conditions. Nix placed 3 devices at strategic locations, programming them to create sound signatures that would draw the infected away from their blocking position. The devices generated the audio patterns of human movement and distress calls, triggering the infected's hunting instincts and causing them to abandon their guard positions. The strategy worked perfectly, but revealed disturbing developments in infected capabilities. The larger specimen demonstrated problem-solving behavior, initially resisting the decoy signals and attempting to direct its group to maintain their positions. Only overwhelming auditory stimulation eventually triggered their pursuit instincts, suggesting that some infected were developing resistance to their established countermeasures. Radio contact with their base revealed additional challenges. Zara reported unusual infected activity around the community center, with multiple groups converging from different directions. The timing suggested coordination or response to their departure, raising the possibility that the infected had developed awareness of human tactical patterns. Their safe house might be compromised by the time they returned from the Haven base mission. Dr. Riven made the difficult decision to increase their movement pace despite the added risks. If their base was under threat, establishing contact with Haven base became even more critical. The larger survivor group possessed resources and capabilities that could support evacuation of their community center population if their defensive position became untenable. The suburban residential area presented different challenges than they had anticipated. Individual infected roamed through houses and yards, creating a distributed threat that was difficult to predict or avoid. Their territorial behaviors differed from the group dynamics they had studied, requiring constant adaptation of their movement strategies. Single infected showed more aggressive pursuit behaviors and seemed less susceptible to distraction techniques. Nix discovered evidence of other survivor groups in the area, recent barricades, supply caches, and defensive positions that suggested organized human activity. However, they also found signs of violent conflict and abandoned positions that indicated these groups had either been overrun or forced to relocate. The infected were clearly winning the territorial struggle for control of urban and suburban areas. As afternoon approached, they encountered their most significant challenge yet. A massive infected concentration, estimated at over 100 specimens, occupied the main commercial district that separated them from Haven base. Radio communication revealed that this was part of a larger horde movement that had begun 3 days earlier, with infected groups consolidating into ever larger formations. The sight through their binoculars was both terrifying and fascinating. The infected moved with unprecedented coordination, establishing perimeter guards, organizing group activities, and demonstrating complex social behaviors that suggested rapid evolutionary adaptation. Whatever had created them was continuing to modify their capabilities, transforming them from individual threats into collective intelligence. Kestrel made the critical decision to attempt a nighttime crossing through the infected concentration's peripheral areas. Their research had shown that darkness affected infected sensory capabilities, particularly their visual tracking. However, it also meant operating in conditions where their own advantages were reduced, requiring absolute trust in their developed tactical systems and each other's abilities. The mission's success would depend on perfect execution of everything they had learned about infected behavior, human cooperation, and survival tactics developed through weeks of desperate adaptation. Darkness brought no comfort as Kestrel's team crouched behind the remnants of a collapsed overpass, watching the massive infected concentration below them. The sheer scale of the horde defied their previous understanding of infected behavior. Over 300 specimens moved through the commercial district with disturbing organization, establishing watch posts, coordinating patrols, and demonstrating communication methods that resembled military formations. Thorn Blackwood felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature as he observed through night vision equipment. The infected had created defensive positions using overturned vehicles and debris, suggesting they could anticipate human tactics and prepare countermeasures. Most alarming, some infected carried crude weapons, pipes, tools, and improvised clubs that indicated tool use capabilities far beyond their initial assessment. Dr. Riven Ashworth documented everything he observed, knowing that this intelligence could prove crucial for human survival. The infected showed clear leadership hierarchies, with larger specimens directing group activities through complex vocalizations and gesture systems. These alphas demonstrated cognitive abilities that approached pre-infection human levels, while maintaining the enhanced physical capabilities and lack of pain response that made them such formidable opponents. Nix Carruthers identified a potential passage through the Horde's eastern perimeter, where patrol patterns created brief windows of opportunity. However, the timing required precise coordination and absolute silence, with no margin for error. A single mistake would alert the entire concentration, creating a pursuit situation that would likely result in their deaths and potentially compromise Haven Base's location. Radio communication with their home base brought increasingly desperate news. Zara reported that infected groups were systematically probing their defenses, testing response times and identifying weak points in their fortifications. The attacks seemed deliberately calculated rather than opportunistic, suggesting that their departure had indeed triggered a coordinated assault on the community center. The decision to proceed through the infected concentration required accepting catastrophic risks, but retreat was no longer viable. Their base was under siege. Haven Base represented their only hope for reinforcement, and time was running out for both groups. Kestrel made the command decision to attempt the crossing, knowing that failure would likely doom everyone they were trying to save. Caspian's electromagnetic pulse devices proved crucial for creating the distraction they needed. The engineer had theorized that the infected's enhanced neural sensitivity would make them vulnerable to electromagnetic interference, and field testing confirmed his hypothesis. Strategic placement of pulse generators created zones of confusion within the Horde, temporarily disrupting their coordination and creating gaps in their defensive perimeter. The crossing began at midnight, with each team member following predetermined routes through the infected concentration. Their survival depended on treating the Horde as a complex obstacle rather than an enemy force, using stealth and misdirection rather than confrontation. Every step required calculating sight lines, sound propagation, and infected patrol movements with mathematical precision. Halfway through the crossing, they encountered their worst nightmare. One of the Alpha infected demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded their expectations, identifying the electromagnetic pulse generators and directing group responses to neutralize them. The infected began adapting to their countermeasures in real time, showing a learning capacity that suggested the viral modifications were still actively developing. Dr. Riven found himself face-to-face with an infected specimen that had once been a young woman, probably in her 20s before infection. What terrified him wasn't her appearance, he had become accustomed to the physical deterioration that infection caused. Instead, he was horrified by the intelligence in her eyes, the recognition that seemed to register his presence, and the calculated way she moved to block his escape route. Thorne's military training saved them from complete disaster. He recognized that they were facing coordinated tactical responses from the infected, requiring counter-tactics that treated them as intelligent adversaries rather than mindless monsters. His combat experience included fighting human enemies who could adapt and respond to changing battlefield conditions, skills that proved transferable to their current situation. The infected woman who had cornered Dr. Riven vocalized in patterns that resembled human speech, attracting attention from other nearby specimens. Nix realized that the infected were using sophisticated communication systems to coordinate their responses, calling in reinforcements and sharing tactical information about the human intruders. They weren't just hunting, they were conducting military operations. Escape required sacrificing their remaining electromagnetic pulse devices in a coordinated detonation that created widespread confusion within the Horde. The temporary disruption allowed them to reach the concentration's perimeter, but alerted the entire group to their presence. Behind them, hundreds of infected began organized pursuit, moving with purpose and coordination that made their previous encounters seem primitive by comparison. Haven Base appeared ahead of them as a fortress-like structure surrounded by proper military fortifications, but the infected pursuit was gaining ground rapidly. Radio communication revealed that the base's defenders had observed their approach and were preparing to provide covering fire, but engaging such a large infected force would risk compromising their position and attracting additional hordes from throughout the region. As they sprinted towards safety, Kestrel realized that their understanding of the infected threat had been fundamentally incomplete. They weren't facing a plague of reanimated corpses or viral zombies. They were confronting a new form of life that combined human intelligence with enhanced physical capabilities and collective coordination. The enemy was evolving faster than human countermeasures could adapt, and their survival would require completely rethinking their strategic approach. The fortress gates of Haven Base opened ahead of them, but behind them came something that might be humanity's replacement as the dominant species on Earth. The massive steel gates of Haven Base slammed shut behind them with a finality that echoed across the compound like a funeral bell. Kestrel Vance collapsed against the interior wall, her lungs burning from the desperate sprint that had barely saved their lives. Behind them, the infected horde pressed against the fortifications with an intelligence that chilled her to the bone. They weren't mindlessly throwing themselves at the barriers but were systematically testing for weaknesses, probing for vulnerabilities with methodical precision. Colonel Marcus Sterling emerged from the Central Command bunker, his weathered face bearing the weight of impossible decisions. At 55, the former Army officer had transformed Haven Base from a refugee camp into a military fortress, but even his experienced eyes widened at the size of the pursuing horde. Through the perimeter cameras, they could see infected scaling buildings, creating human ladders, and coordinating complex maneuvers that defied everything they thought they knew about the enemy. Dr. Riven Ashworth found himself in heated discussion with Haven Base's research team, comparing notes about infected evolution that painted an increasingly grim picture. The virus wasn't simply reanimating dead tissue, it was creating a hybrid species that combined human cognitive abilities with enhanced physical capabilities and collective consciousness. The infected were becoming something that might be superior to humanity in every measurable way. Thorne Blackwood joined the defensive planning session, where Haven Base's military personnel outlined their strategic situation. They possessed significant firepower, including heavy weapons and armored vehicles, but ammunition was limited and their position was ultimately unsustainable. Radio communications indicated that similar infected concentrations were emerging throughout the region, suggesting a coordinated transformation that stretched far beyond their local area. The most disturbing revelation came from Zara's radio contact with their community center. The base had fallen after a coordinated assault that demonstrated unprecedented tactical sophistication. The infected had used diversionary attacks, coordinated timing, and systematic dismantling of defensive positions. Survivors had scattered into the surrounding countryside, but their fate remained unknown and communications had been lost. Colonel Sterling outlined Haven Base's evacuation plan, developed in response to intelligence about massive infected movements throughout the state. Military installations further north had reported success in establishing secure zones, but reaching them would require a dangerous journey through hundreds of miles of infected-controlled territory. The alternative was remaining at Haven Base and fighting a siege they couldn't possibly win. Nix Carruthers provided crucial intelligence about infected capabilities that forced immediate revision of evacuation plans. The enemy was demonstrating advanced reconnaissance abilities, with scout groups operating far ahead of main concentrations to identify human movements and defensive positions. Any large-scale evacuation would be detected and intercepted long before reaching safety. The infected horde outside Haven Base continued growing throughout the night, with new groups arriving from multiple directions. Dawn revealed a concentration of over 800 specimens organized into distinct tactical units, with clear command structures and coordinated objectives. They had Haven Base completely surrounded and were beginning systematic preparations for what appeared to be a complex assault operation. Dr. Riven made a breakthrough discovery while analyzing infected tissue samples provided by Haven Base's research team. The viral modifications were still actively progressing, with infected specimens showing continued neurological development weeks after initial infection. This explained their rapidly improving tactical capabilities, but also suggested that their evolution was far from complete. The infected might eventually develop abilities that would make human resistance completely impossible. Kestrel found herself appointed to coordinate joint tactical planning between Haven Base's military structure and her group's survival innovations. The combination of conventional military capabilities with their adaptive countermeasures offered possibilities that neither group could achieve alone. However, time was critically short, and the infected were clearly preparing for a final assault that would test every strategy they could devise. Caspian Reed worked feverishly to scale up his electromagnetic pulse technology using Haven Base's superior resources. The engineer had discovered that massive pulse generation could disrupt infected coordination over wider areas, potentially creating opportunities for breakthrough operations. However, the power requirements were enormous, and they would only get one chance to deploy the system before infected adaptation rendered it useless. The psychological toll of their situation became increasingly apparent as survivors struggled with the reality of their circumstances. Indira Frost worked with Haven Base's personnel to maintain group cohesion, but morale was deteriorating rapidly. Many survivors had reached the conclusion that they were fighting a losing war against an enemy that was becoming stronger while humanity grew weaker with each passing day. Radio communications brought reports of similar situations from across the country. Major cities had fallen to coordinated infected assaults, military units were reporting strategic withdrawals from untenable positions, and government communications had largely ceased. The infected transformation appeared to be approaching critical mass, with human civilization collapsing under the weight of an enemy that combined intelligence, coordination, and physical superiority. As the second night approached, infected preparations for assault became increasingly apparent. They had constructed siege equipment from salvaged materials, organized specialized attack units for different operational roles, and established communication networks that coordinated activities across the entire surrounding area. The final battle would test whether human ingenuity and cooperation could overcome an enemy that was rapidly evolving beyond their ability to counter. Colonel Sterling made the decision to attempt a breakthrough operation rather than endure a siege they couldn't win. The plan required perfect coordination, tremendous sacrifice, and more luck than any rational person would expect, but it represented their only chance for survival and the possibility of warning other human settlements about the true nature of what they faced. The electromagnetic pulse detonated at exactly 0347 hours, sending cascades of disruption through the infected horde surrounding Haven Base. Kestrel Vance watched through the command center's monitors as 800 infected suddenly staggered in confusion, their coordination shattered by the massive electromagnetic interference that Caspian Reed had engineered. The window of opportunity would last perhaps 10 minutes before their enhanced nervous systems adapted to the disruption. Colonel Sterling's convoy of armored vehicles burst through the fortress gates in perfect formation, their heavy weapons cutting devastating paths through the disoriented infected ranks. Thorne Blackwood led the advance team, using every tactical lesson learned during weeks of desperate survival to guide the vehicles through the chaotic battlefield. Behind them, Haven Base burned as predetermined demolitions ensured that their fortifications and resources wouldn't fall into infected hands. Dr. Riven Ashworth clutched his research materials as their vehicle careened through the infected concentration, knowing that his documentation of viral evolution might be humanity's only hope for understanding what they truly faced. The infected were already beginning to recover from the electromagnetic disruption, their adaptation rate exceeding even his most pessimistic projections. Within minutes, they would be coordinating pursuit with enhanced tactics designed to counter human countermeasures. Nix Carruthers served as navigator for the convoy, her intimate knowledge of infected behavioral patterns allowing her to predict their recovery and response times with uncanny accuracy. Through the vehicle's rear window, she watched as the infected began reorganizing with frightening efficiency, their confusion giving way to calculated pursuit that demonstrated learning capabilities far beyond human comprehension. The convoy's destination was a military evacuation point 60 miles north, where air transport might carry survivors to secure zones in the Northern Territories. However, radio communications painted an increasingly grim picture of infected advancement throughout the region. The enemy was demonstrating strategic coordination across hundreds of miles, suggesting a level of collective intelligence that approached superintelligence. 20 miles into their escape, the convoy encountered proof that their electromagnetic pulse strategy had been anticipated. Infected groups had established blocking positions along their route, using defensive arrangements that suggested they had predicted human tactical responses and prepared countermeasures. The enemy was not merely adapting, they were thinking several moves ahead, demonstrating strategic planning capabilities that matched or exceeded human military doctrine. Caspian Reed's mobile jamming equipment provided temporary advantages as they fought through successive infected roadblocks, but each engagement revealed further evolution in infected capabilities. They were using captured human weapons, coordinating complex tactical maneuvers, and demonstrating problem-solving abilities that suggested the viral modifications were still rapidly progressing toward unknown endpoints. The most chilling discovery came when Dr. Riven observed infected specimens attempting to communicate with their convoy through crude but recognizable human speech. The viral restructuring hadn't simply enhanced their physical capabilities, it was restoring and improving their cognitive functions while maintaining the aggressive characteristics that made them such effective predators. They were becoming something that combined the best aspects of human intelligence with capabilities that exceeded baseline human limitations. 30 miles from their destination, they encountered the largest infected concentration any survivor had reported, over 3,000 specimens organized into a formation that resembled a military division. Radio intercepts revealed that this force was coordinating with similar concentrations throughout the state, suggesting that the infected had achieved strategic-level organization that spanned hundreds of miles and involved tens of thousands of specimens. Colonel Sterling made the decision that would haunt the survivors forever. Faced with an enemy force that could not be defeated or bypassed, he ordered the convoy to split up, with small groups attempting to reach safety through different routes. The military vehicles would serve as decoys, drawing infected pursuit while civilian survivors attempted to escape through less defended corridors. Kestrel found herself separated from most of her original team, traveling with Dr. Riven and Nix in a civilian vehicle that had minimal defensive capabilities. Their survival depended entirely on stealth and the hope that the infected would focus their pursuit on the more visible military targets. Behind them, explosions and weapons fire marked the convoy's final battle against an enemy that had evolved beyond their ability to resist. The evacuation point was a chaos of desperate humanity when they finally arrived. Military personnel were loading the last transport aircraft as infected forces closed in from multiple directions. The scope of the collapse was evident in radio communications. Cities had fallen, military units were in full retreat, and government authority had effectively ceased to exist in most regions. As their aircraft lifted off into the dawn sky, Kestrel looked down at a landscape that no longer belonged to humanity. Infected concentrations stretched to the horizon, organized into formations that suggested they were establishing permanent territorial control. The enemy had won not through overwhelming force, but through superior adaptation and evolution that had outpaced every human countermeasure. Dr. Riven continued documenting his observations during the flight north, knowing that future human survival would depend on understanding what they had encountered. The infected weren't simply an enhanced version of humanity, they represented an evolutionary leap that might be inevitable, a species that combined human intelligence with capabilities that exceeded biological limitations. 6 months later, in the secure mountain installations that represented humanity's last bastions, Kestrel served as a tactical advisor for increasingly desperate resistance operations. The infected had consolidated control over most inhabited areas and were demonstrating technological capabilities that suggested they were continuing to evolve beyond anything that could be considered recognizably human. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between crisis meetings and strategic planning sessions, she wondered if they had witnessed the end of one chapter in Earth's history and the beginning of another. The infected had achieved something that humanity had struggled toward for millennia: true unity of purpose, enhanced capabilities, and freedom from the physical and psychological limitations that had constrained human development. The war was far from over, but its outcome seemed increasingly inevitable. Humanity's children might inherit a world where their species was no longer the dominant intelligence, where survival meant adapting to circumstances controlled by minds that had once been human but had become something unprecedented and perhaps unstoppable. In her final report, Kestrel wrote, "We fought bravely, we adapted brilliantly, and we learned too late that our enemy was not just changing, it was becoming what we ourselves might have evolved into, given enough time and different circumstances. The question now is not whether we can win, but whether we can find a way to coexist with what we helped create." The radio crackled with reports of new infected capabilities emerging daily, and somewhere in the darkness, Nyx Carruthers continued her reconnaissance missions, documenting the evolution of a species that had surpassed its creators and inherited the Earth.